First tonight, a crucial week for Ukraine, with 3 European leaders visiting the White House this week to try to persuade Donald Trump not to impose a ceasefire on it that could see Russia regroup and attack Ukraine again. And today it's the turn of the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who is in Washington meeting President Trump for talks focusing on the war in Ukraine. Mr. Starmer told journalists that promises of what he called a US backstop would be needed to deter President Putin from attacking Ukraine again after any ceasefire. Earlier, Mr. Trump said it was up to Europe to protect Ukraine, and he wouldn't give any assurances of Washington's involvement. Mr. Starmer said that Britain would play its part. And we're told actually that Mr. Starmer is just about to go into that meeting with Mr. Trump. We will bring you details of that as soon as we get it. We're looking at live pictures now of Washington, the White House, and his arrival, we're told, is imminent. That's Mr. Starmer's arrival, and when he does, we will take you there live. Meanwhile, negotiators from Russia and the US are meeting in Istanbul as they seek to restore diplomatic ties following the return of President Trump to the White House. The talks come a week after the chief Russian and American diplomats agreed to start negotiations on ending Russia's war against Ukraine without involving Kyiv. The Kremlin spokesman has restated that Russia is not prepared to return occupied territories that it claims to have annexed. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. So, as we mentioned at the outset, a crucial week for Ukraine, with 3 European leaders visiting the White House this week to try to persuade Donald Trump not to impose a ceasefire that could see Russia regroup and attack Ukraine again. Today, it's the turn of Keir Starmer. We're just looking at live pictures of the White House a hot second ago, and we will go to it. Those are the pictures there. We will go to those pictures again once Mr. Starmer is there. But he is meeting President Trump for talks centering on the war in Ukraine, among other things. I mean, it's quite a time for this visit by Mr. Starmer to be happening. I mean, how important is it?
For Great Britain, it's extremely important. USA is its chief ally. The USA is an important market for Great Britain, not just goods, but investment, services. It has always asserted there's a special relationship between America and the UK because, of course, America was a former colony back in the 18th century. And therefore, from Great Britain's point of view, it is a vital meeting. Moreover, Keir Starmer would like the tariff war, which is now opening up not just with China, but also Mexico and Canada, but now also with the EU, of course, following the announcement last night, to leave out Great Britain. So Great Britain's going to just basically sit it out whilst the Americans and the Europeans fight. This is the key goal. And that the Americans won't leave Ukraine. In other words, a continuation of NATO without NATO. For USA, it is a minor visit. The actual talks in Istanbul with Russia are as important easily, because these quiet talks that no one ever notices are actually the bedrock of diplomacy. Moreover, Donald Trump has made his position quite clear, and it's unlikely that, having made a very public statement, he will back down just after a talk with Great Britain, who is not a superpower, but, if you like, an old ally. And therefore, I imagine that there's this discrepancy from the word go. It is true that Donald Trump liked the raise from 2.3 to 2.5% defense spending, but it's only a small amount in reality, and therefore it's not of vital importance to the USA.
Well, I'm going to return to the issues that are going to be discussed in a moment. But I mean, looking at the two men, Mr. Trump, more of a showman, Mr. Starmer, seen as quite the diplomat. So two very different personality types. I mean, how do you reckon they'll get on?
Well, Sir Keith Starmer's an affable, pleasant man, very quiet, as you said, but he doesn't pick fights, so I can't see there be any difficulty on a personal chemistry basis. As for Donald Trump, if he has a quiet man as his interlocutor, that gives him all the more opportunity to show off. And so, therefore, from that point of view, I imagine that he will actually enjoy these talks. So, on a personal basis, I see no problem at all.
And as you mentioned, one of Sir Keir's goals is to try to persuade Donald Trump not to abandon Ukraine and not to do a deal with Vladimir Putin. How do you reckon that's going to go?
I'm afraid I don't see much opportunity for Sir Keith Starmer to change Donald Trump's mind. The real problem is that Donald Trump has made it quite clear publicly several times what his policy is. It seems very unlikely that for the sake of a minor old ally, he's suddenly going to do an about-face. Therefore, this part is impossible. What he might get is some minor concessions that say America will continue to supply arms or America will carry on having an interest. But he has made it quite clear, Donald Trump, he wants the Europeans to do any policing. He doesn't want American boots on the ground there. He does want America's security ties and these sort of entanglements, and therefore he's unlikely to change this. From that point of view, Sir Keith Starmer's visit is a waste, although the important thing, as I stress, is it does keep up the relationship between Great Britain and America, which is very important in the long run.
And of course, talking about relationship, there's the issue of making sure that President Trump remains engaged with Europe and remains committed to the Transatlantic alliance. So pretty high stakes there.
Yes, unfortunately, again, there seem to be a dead in the water. There is now a trade war of all things building up between USA and the EU, which, of course, Sir Keith Starmer hopes to keep Great Britain out of. The Europeans have been twice over just left out, not only with the negotiations with Russia, but also recently about the rare earths agreement with Ukraine. Donald Trump has virtually no interest in Europe. He's also very negative about the EU. He has expressed himself quite forcefully about this, which is quite strange because the Americans are one of the people who actually backed the EU being set up as a bulwark against Russia. But Donald Trump doesn't see it that way because he prefers to work with Russia, as far as I can tell, and doesn't need a bulwark. So therefore, what is happening here is that NATO is dead in the water and the EU is being seen as simply another, if you like, bloc, like China, but of course friendlier. There will be some negotiations. I think it's got its arithmetic wrong slightly on the trade side, but there's no question that there is a rift, a transatlantic rift, and Sir Keith Starmer's visit won't be able to patch this up, if only because Great Britain is no longer in the EU, so it's not entitled to speak about European-American relations.
Well, indeed. But, I mean, let me take you up on that, because, I mean, given that Mr. Trump seems to loathe the European Union, I wonder whether now that Britain is outside the EU, I mean, the UK might escape the same tariff treatment.
Yes, that is Sir Keith Starmer's goal. I think myself personally, that's his primary goal. And there is a good chance that he will get mitigated terms or escape the trade war altogether. As far as I can tell, there's been no real threat against Great Britain, except the fact that Great Britain is in the continent of Europe. But it's not part of the EU. I think there's a very good chance that in this respect, especially because Sir Keith Starmer is this diplomatic person, that Great Britain will escape the worst of Donald Trump's wrath.
And of course, Mr. Starmer going to America after increasing defence spending in the UK, if he fails to get Mr. Trump to remove the UK from the list of countries that he might impose tariffs on. I mean, that could derail Mr. Starmer's economic plans for the UK, couldn't they?
I think not just in one respect, because you've suggested maybe economically, but politically as well. There would be no immediate point having an increased defense budget if America's not going to come along. Where it might still remain is if the Russian threat is seen as being very acute towards Great Britain. But I think there may well be a change in policy to some degree if nothing positive emerges out of this meeting. There is also another minor troubling aspect about this meeting. Donald Trump saw Macron, the president of France, first. That's just a tiny hint that he sees the EU as more important than Great Britain, which may be good in the sense that Great Britain escapes the tariffs, but at the same time means that Keith Starmer's role and influence suggests to be less than that of the EU and France.
Well, of course, the EU is one of the biggest single markets in the world, and it's got a trade deficit in its favor with the United States of over $200 billion. And of course, they've threatened to hit back at the US if it does impose those tariffs. So essentially, the UK and the EU both falling out with America over economic and security issues. I mean, could this become a full-blown transatlantic geopolitical crisis?
Yeah, it is possible, yes. It already is a crisis, but the EU has played down all its humiliations. If the EU really stood on its dignity, then to be quite honest, 3 times over it's been now, so to speak, humiliated by America. And I'm almost certain the EU is quite prepared to put up tariffs, and I'm quite certain the EU is already working out just how to retaliate. The retaliation by EU against America will then mean this rift in transatlantic relations between the EU and America. So Keith Starmer's goal is to keep Britain out of all these quarrels. I think there's a good chance he can succeed on that, so Great Britain will miss the worst of this rift and trade bloc war.
Well, we'll be keeping an eye on that, and as I mentioned earlier, Keir Starmer is just about to arrive at the White House to start that meeting with Donald Trump. We will bring you that as soon as we can. We're looking at live pictures now, but in the meantime, I want to thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, who is the international affairs analyst, and he was talking to me on the line there from London.